Welcome to Sincere Stories. Today, I'll share a story. My name is John, and I'm 62 years old. I've been married to my wife, Mary, for 25 years, and we live in Charlotte, North Carolina. To the outside world, we were that couple that everyone admired. You know, the ones people look at and think, they've got it all figured out. Mary, with her beautiful blonde hair and bright blue eyes, always seemed so perfect. Stylish, well-groomed, and always with a smile that could light up a room. For the longest time, our life was calm and happy. We had our routines, our jokes, our little rituals that kept us connected through the years. We'd sit on our porch every Sunday morning, sipping coffee and talking about everything and nothing at all. I always felt like we were on the same team, facing whatever life threw at us together. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, things started to change. It began a couple of years ago. Mary had been traveling a lot for work, New York, Charleston, places that were just a bit too far to come home every night. I didn't think much of it at first. Mary was successful in her job, and I wanted to support her. But then, the trips became more frequent, and she began to stay late for meetings. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her behavior became off. Strange. She started hiding her phone, which she never used to do. She'd turn it face down whenever she set it on the table, and if it rang when I was nearby, she'd rush to answer it, always walking away to talk. If I asked her about her day, her answers were short, her tone defensive. The Mary the first knew, open, warm, and loving, was slowly fading away, replaced by someone distant and secretive. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid. We've been married for 25 years, for God's sake. We've built a life together, raised kids, gone through ups and downs like everyone else. But the more I noticed, the harder it became to ignore. One evening, I found her sitting on the edge of our bed, scrolling through her phone. When she saw me enter the room, she quickly locked it and put it away. I caught a glimpse of something on her face, anxiety, maybe even guilt. I asked her who she was texting, and she just smiled that tight, strained smile and said, "Oh, just work stuff." But I could feel it. Something was off. And that's when the doubt started to creep in. It was during one of those work trips to New York that the first real sign appeared. Mary had left early on a Friday morning, saying she'd be back late Sunday night. I remember watching her pack the night before, meticulously folding her clothes, humming quietly to herself. She was dressed in a way I hadn't seen in a while, fitted skirt, new blouse, and heels that seemed more suited for a fancy dinner than a business meeting. I didn't say anything then, but something inside me twisted. When she got to New York, she didn't call me until late that night. I'd tried her several times throughout the day, but each call went straight to voicemail. When she finally picked up, her voice sounded different, almost breathless. I asked her why she hadn't answered earlier, and she brushed it off, saying she'd been caught up in back-to-back meetings. I tried to let it go, but it nagged at me, that tiny flicker of doubt growing a bit brighter. The following week, things didn't improve. Mary seemed distracted, often lost in her thoughts. She was always on her phone, her fingers flying over the screen in rapid movements, a small, secretive smile playing on her lips. I started to feel like a stranger in my own home, like I was living with someone I didn't know anymore. I began watching her more closely, trying to pick up on the smallest clues, anything that might explain her behavior. Then, one evening, she came home unusually late. She hadn't called or texted to let me know where she was, which was unlike her. I waited up, pacing the living room, my anxiety growing with every passing minute. Finally, just after midnight, I heard the front door creak open. She stepped in, looking startled to see me still awake. Her face was flushed, her hair slightly tousled, and there was a faint trace of perfume I didn't recognize. "Hey," she said, trying to sound casual, "I didn't expect you to wait up. I had a meeting that ran late, and then I grabbed dinner with a few colleagues." I didn't buy it. I tried to keep my voice steady, to mask the unease in my gut. "Why didn't you call?" She hesitated, just for a split second, but I caught it. "Oh, I guess I just lost track of time. I'm sorry, John. But her apology felt hollow, like a line she was reciting, not something she meant. And I could see it again, that flicker of anxiety in her eyes. I nodded, forcing a smile. It's fine. I just worry, you know? Mary smiled back, but it didn't reach her eyes. I know, she whispered, then quickly changed the subject, asking if I'd had dinner. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was trying to distract me, steer the conversation away from where it was heading. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling while she slept beside me, her breathing soft and steady. My mind was racing. I kept replaying the events of the day, wondering what I might have missed. I wanted to trust her, I really did, but I could feel the cracks starting to form. And then there was her phone. Always with her, always face down, like it held a secret she didn't want me to see. I had never been the kind of husband to check on my wife's private messages, but suddenly, I found myself tempted. I wanted to know, to understand what was going on, to get rid of this awful feeling gnawing at my insides. I decided to let it go, just for that night. But in the pit of my stomach, I knew things were different now. I was no longer just her husband, I was her detective, too. The feeling of doubt continued to gnaw at me over the next few days, like a splinter I couldn't remove. I started losing sleep, lying awake at night wondering what Mary was hiding. It was driving me mad, this constant questioning, the not knowing. I needed someone to talk to, someone who could give me a different perspective. So, I called up Mike, my best friend since high school. Mike and I had been through it all together, college, first jobs, marriages. He'd always been my go-to guy whenever I needed advice. If anyone could help me figure this out, it would be him. We met at our usual spot, a little bar on the outskirts of town where we used to go in our younger days. It was quiet that afternoon, just a few regulars nursing their drinks. I settled onto the bar stool, and Mike slid in beside me. He could see the worry etched across my face. "What's going on, John? You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, his voice light, but with a tinge of concern. I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "It's Mary," I finally said. "Something's not right. She's been acting different." Mike raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" I hesitated, not wanting to sound paranoid, but I laid it all out, the late nights, the trips, the phone always hidden away, the strange looks in her eyes. As I spoke, Mike listened intently, nodding occasionally but not interrupting. When I was done, he took a slow sip of his beer and leaned back. "Look, John," he said carefully, "I know Mary. I know how much she loves you. But, yeah, that sounds a little weird, I gotta admit. Have you talked to her about it?" I shook my head. "No, not really. I mean, I've asked her a few times, but she just brushes it off or changes the subject. I don't want to accuse her of something that might not be true, you know? I don't know what to think." Mike tapped his fingers on the bar, thinking. "Okay, here's what I'd do," he said finally. "Don't jump to conclusions. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's just work stress or something she's dealing with on her own. But keep an eye on it. Watch her behavior, see if there are more signs. If it keeps getting worse, then you might have to confront her. But don't let this eat you alive, John. You've been together too long to let suspicion tear you apart without good reason." I nodded, feeling a bit more grounded after hearing his advice. Mike was right, I needed to be patient, not let my imagination run wild. I decided then and there that I would give it some time, try to be understanding, and see if things got back to normal. We talked for a while longer, mostly about old times and the things that had changed over the years. Mike tried to lighten the mood with a few jokes, but I could see the worry in his eyes. Even he sensed that something was off, and that didn't exactly help my nerves. As I drove home, I couldn't help but feel a little bit better, like I had a plan now, some kind of strategy. But as the house came into view, I felt the uneasiness settle back in. Mary's car was in the driveway, and the lights were on in the kitchen. I took a deep breath, preparing myself to walk through that front door and pretend everything was fine. I wasn't sure if I could keep doing that much longer. That night, I watched Mary more closely than ever. I noticed how she avoided my gaze, how she seemed lost in thought, how she excused herself to the bedroom and shut the door behind her. I heard the muffled sound of her voice on the phone, speaking in hushed tones, and it felt like a knife twisting in my chest. And I kept thinking about Mike's words, "Don't let suspicion tear you apart without good reason." But what if I already had my reason? A few weeks passed, and things only seemed to get stranger. Mary's trips became even more frequent, and each time, her excuses sounded less convincing. She had begun mentioning a new friend, Steve, a name that started popping up in conversations a little too often. "Steve said the funniest thing today," she'd say over dinner, or, "Steve recommended this great place in Charleston." It was subtle at first, but it didn't take long for me to notice. Whenever she talked about Steve, her voice seemed lighter, almost excited. One Saturday morning, while we were having breakfast, she casually mentioned that she was going to play golf with Steve. I nearly choked on my coffee. "Golf?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Since when do you play golf?" Mary looked up, a bit startled. "Oh, I've just started taking some lessons," she replied, waving it off like it was no big deal. "Steve's a really good player, and he's been giving me some pointers." I nodded, but inside, a storm was brewing. Mary had never once shown any interest in golf. In fact, she used to joke about how boring it seemed. And now she was taking lessons? With Steve? I could feel my pulse quicken, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to ask. I decided to test the waters. "Must be nice to have a hobby," I said, trying to sound casual. "I didn't know you were getting so close to this Steve guy." She smiled, but there was something guarded in her expression. "Oh, he's just a friend," she said quickly. "He's really nice, and we have a lot in common." I couldn't let it go. "A lot in common, huh? Like what?" Mary's smile faltered, just for a moment. "Just stuff," she shrugged. "We talk about work, travel, that sort of thing. It's nothing serious, John." But it sounded serious to me. Too serious. I watched her for a moment longer, looking for any sign, any hint of something more. But she just sipped her coffee and changed the subject, talking about a new project she was starting at work. I tried to listen, but my mind was elsewhere, filled with images of Mary and Steve together, laughing, talking, doing God knows what else. That night, I lay awake again, my mind replaying every little detail, every conversation about this new friend. Was it all in my head? Was I just overreacting, seeing things that weren't there? I felt like I was spiraling, trapped in a whirlwind of doubt and suspicion. I decided to do a little investigating of my own. The next day, while Mary was out with friends, I found her golf bag in the garage. It looked almost brand new, barely used. I pulled out a couple of clubs and inspected them, clean, without a single scratch. I knew it. She wasn't learning golf, she was pretending to. I felt my chest tighten with a mix of anger and fear. Who was this Steve? Why was she lying to me? I grabbed my phone and searched his name online, but it was too common to get any useful results. Frustrated, I put the phone down, my mind racing again. I thought about asking her outright, but I wasn't ready for that conversation yet. I needed more information, more proof. I didn't want to accuse her without knowing for sure. But every instinct in my body told me that there was something going on, something more than just friendship. A few days later, Mary announced she'd be going away for a weekend trip with some girlfriends to Charleston. I watched her as she packed her bag, noting the fancy dresses, the new lingerie she was carefully folding and tucking away. She caught me looking and smiled nervously. "It's just a fun girls' weekend," she said lightly, but I could hear the tremor in her voice. "We're planning to relax, do some shopping, maybe hit a spa." I forced a smile, but inside, my heart was pounding. "Sounds like a good time," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. "Be safe, okay?" Mary leaned in and kissed my cheek. "Of course, I will," she whispered. but as I watched her walk out the door, I felt a cold dread settle in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't just going away with friends. And I knew I needed to find out the truth, no matter what it took. The morning Mary left for Charleston, a knot of dread sat heavy in my stomach. I watched her from the window as she loaded her suitcase into the car. She was wearing a new dress, a bit too nice for a casual weekend with friends, I thought. Her movements were quick and deliberate, like she was nervous to get out the door. Before she got in the car, she glanced back at the house and gave me a little wave. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. I waved back, trying to look calm, but inside, I felt like my heart was pounding out of my chest. The second she disappeared around the corner, I grabbed my phone and called Mike. "She's gone," I said as soon as he answered. Mike was quiet for a second before replying. "You still thinking about going down there?" "Yeah," I admitted. "I can't sit here another weekend wondering. I've got to know." "All right, John," he sighed. "If you're sure, let's do it. I'll drive. Meet me at my place in an hour?" I agreed, and before I knew it, I was in Mike's car, a thermos of coffee between us, heading south toward Charleston. The drive was tense, the silence between us filled with everything we didn't want to say. Mike kept glancing over at me, probably wondering if I was ready for whatever we might find. We reached Charleston in the early afternoon, the city bathed in warm sunlight. I'd always loved this place, the old brick streets, the oak trees dripping with Spanish moss. But now, it felt like enemy territory. My chest tightened as we got closer to the hotel Mary had mentioned. She'd casually brought it up earlier in the week, probably not realizing I was listening so closely. We parked a block away and walked to the hotel. It was a small, charming place with ivy crawling up the walls, a perfect spot for a romantic getaway. I felt a twist of anger in my gut just looking at it. We found a place to sit across the street, close enough to watch the entrance without being seen. Mike nudged my arm, reminding me to breathe. Minutes crawled by like hours. My mind raced with thoughts I couldn't control. What would I say if I saw her? What if I was wrong? But then, I saw her. Mary walked out of the hotel with Steve. They were side by side, and he had his hand on the small of her back like it was the most natural thing in the world. I felt a rush of blood to my face, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. They were smiling, leaning into each other, sharing something that was just theirs. I didn't even need to hear their words to know what it meant. My worst fears were confirmed. It was like a punch to the gut, seeing them together like that. I'd been holding on to some hope that I was wrong, that maybe it was all in my head. But there it was, right in front of me. No more doubt, no more guessing. Mike put a hand on my shoulder. "John," he said quietly, "what do you want to do?" I stared at them, my mind spinning. Part of me wanted to run across the street and confront them, shout at them right there in front of everyone. Another part of me just wanted to turn around and walk away, to get in the car and drive until I couldn't think anymore. But I needed to know how deep this went. I couldn't just leave it at this. "Let's follow them," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. "I need to see where this leads." Mike nodded. We fell in behind them, keeping a safe distance, my heart pounding with every step. The world felt like it was tilting under my feet, but there was no turning back now. I had to know the truth, no matter how much it might hurt. We trailed them for about an hour. Mary and Steve were oblivious, caught up in their own world, strolling down the cobblestone streets of Charleston, stopping occasionally to look at some window display or laugh at a private joke. They seemed so relaxed, so comfortable with each other, it was like they were on some romantic getaway. "Are you sure you want to keep doing this?" Mike asked quietly as we paused behind a corner. I could hear the concern in his voice. "You've seen enough, haven't you?" I hesitated, staring at them from a distance. Mary looked so different with him, carefree, almost like the woman she used to be when we first met. It stung to realize I hadn't seen her smile like that in years. Was it because of him? Or was it something I'd lost over the years, something I couldn't give her anymore? "No," I said finally, my voice tense. "Not yet." I need to know for sure. Mike nodded, though I could tell he wasn't thrilled about it. He was a good friend, willing to support me, even if it meant doing something neither of us wanted to do. They kept walking, and we stayed back, trying not to be seen. I was barely aware of the sights and sounds around us. All I could focus on was Mary and Steve. After a while, they headed into a small cafe. Mike and I found a spot across the street, just close enough to keep an eye on them through the window. "They're just sitting there," Mike muttered. "Talking, laughing, they look happy." I swallowed hard, trying to push down the bitterness rising in my throat. "Maybe that's all it is," I said, almost to myself. "Maybe they're just friends." Mike shot me a skeptical look. "Come on, John. You know better than that. You saw the way they were looking at each other. The way he touched her. Friends don't do that." He was right, of course. But part of me wanted so badly to believe there was some innocent explanation. Maybe Mary was just going through a phase, a midlife crisis, something we could work through together. Maybe this wasn't what it looked like. But deep down, I knew better. We waited another half an hour before Mary and Steve finally stood up and left the cafe. I watched them closely as they walked down the street, his hand brushing against hers. They were heading toward a more secluded part of town, where the narrow streets grew quieter, and the old buildings seemed to close in around us. "Where are they going?" I whispered, more to myself than to Mike. He shrugged. "Could be anywhere. Maybe they're just going for a walk." But I wasn't convinced. I felt my pulse quicken as they turned a corner and disappeared from view. "Come on," I urged, and we hurried after them, trying to stay quiet, trying not to attract attention. When we rounded the corner, I saw them standing in front of a large, gated villa. It was a beautiful place, old and elegant, with high walls and big glass windows. My breath caught in my throat as I watched Steve pull out a key and unlock the gate. Mary stepped inside, looking over her shoulder once, but she didn't see us. "They have a key," Mike said quietly. "This isn't just a walk in the park, John. They're going somewhere private." I felt a sharp pain in my chest, a mix of anger and heartbreak. I didn't need to see anymore. I knew now. I knew enough to understand what was happening, what had been happening for God knows how long. But I needed proof. I needed to see it with my own eyes, even if it destroyed me. "Let's get closer," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. Mike looked at me like I'd lost my mind, but he nodded. We moved toward the side of the villa, staying low, using the shrubs and trees for cover. When we reached the fence, we spotted a security camera near the gate. Mike grabbed my arm. "Hold on," he whispered. "We have to disable that. If they've got cameras, they'll see us coming." I nodded, my heart racing. We managed to find a small rock and threw it at the camera, knocking it slightly to the side. I prayed it was enough to keep us out of view. Then, we climbed over the fence, moving slowly, carefully, trying to make as little noise as possible. We crept along the side of the villa, our eyes scanning the big glass windows. My heart was in my throat. I knew I was about to see something I could never unsee, but I had to know. I had to know for sure. And then, through the window, I saw them. Mary and Steve were inside, sitting on a couch. They were laughing, his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. I could see her face, her smile, the way she looked at him with a kind of tenderness I hadn't seen in years. Then, slowly, he leaned in, and they kissed. A deep, lingering kiss that left no room for doubt. I felt like the ground had fallen out from under me. I wanted to burst through the door, to shout, to demand answers. But I couldn't move. I stood there, frozen, watching my wife kiss another man, my heart shattering into pieces. "John," Mike whispered, his voice tight with concern. "John, we should go." But I didn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the scene inside, from the betrayal playing out before me. I had come for the truth, and now I had it, clear as day. And it hurt more than I ever imagined it would. I don't know how long I stood there, watching Mary and Steve through the window, feeling my world collapse around me. It could have been minutes, or it could have been hours. Time didn't seem to matter anymore. All I could see was my wife in the arms of another man, laughing, kissing him as if I didn't exist, as if our life together had meant nothing. Mike tugged at my sleeve, his voice low but urgent. "John, we've seen enough. Let's get out of here before they notice us." His words barely registered. I felt like I was underwater, everything muffled and distant. I knew he was right. Staying any longer wouldn't do me any good. But leaving meant accepting what I'd just witnessed, and I wasn't sure I was ready for that. Still, I let Mike pull me away from the window, and we quietly made our way back to the fence. My mind was numb, my heart heavy with the weight of betrayal. We climbed over the fence, just as carefully as before, and once we were on the other side, I felt like I could finally breathe again. We found a secluded spot a few blocks away, out of sight, and sat down on a bench. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the street. I stared at the ground, unable to meet Mike's eyes. I didn't want to see the pity there, didn't want to acknowledge how pathetic I must look. Mike was silent for a while, giving me space, letting me process what I'd just seen. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle, but firm. "John, I know this is hard. Harder than anything you've probably ever faced. But you've got to decide what you're going to do now." I looked up at him, my throat tight with emotion. "I don't know what to do, Mike. I feel like my whole life has just ended. How do I come back from this?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You don't have to decide everything right now. But you need to think about what you want, what you can live with. If you can forgive her, if you even want to try. Or if it's better to just walk away." Forgive her? The thought seemed impossible, like trying to mend a broken vase with pieces that would never fit together again. But the alternative, ending it, walking away from 25 years of marriage, felt just as unbearable. "I don't know if I can do either," I admitted, my voice shaking. "I love her, Mike. Even after everything, I still love her. But this. I don't know if I can ever get past this." Mike nodded, his expression somber. "It's not something anyone can tell you how to handle. But whatever you do, you need to do it for yourself. Not because you're afraid of being alone, or because you're clinging to what you used to have. You need to figure out what's best for you, John. What's going to let you live with yourself when all of this is over." I knew he was right, but that didn't make it any easier. I felt like I was being torn in two, caught between the love I still had for Mary and the pain of her betrayal. I wanted to confront her, to make her see how much she'd hurt me. But I also wanted to run, to escape from the crushing weight of what I'd just seen. I think I need to talk to her," I said finally, though the thought made me sick to my stomach. "I can't just let this sit. I need to hear her side, even if it doesn't change anything." Mike looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. "All right. But don't do it tonight. You're too raw right now, and you'll say things you might regret. Wait until you've had some time to cool down, to think about what you really want to say." I knew he was right, but the idea of waiting felt unbearable. Still, I didn't have the strength to argue. "Okay," I agreed, even though I wasn't sure I could keep that promise. Mike stood up and offered me his hand. "Come on, let's get you out of here. You don't need to be anywhere near this place right now." I took his hand and let him pull me to my feet. My legs felt like lead as we walked back to the car. Every step away from that villa felt like a step away from the life I thought I knew, and towards something unknown and terrifying. As we drove back to Charlotte, the reality of what I'd seen started to sink in. The tears came suddenly, without warning, and I turned my face to the window, not wanting Mike to see me break down. I'd never felt so lost, so completely broken. When we finally pulled into my driveway, it was dark. The house loomed in front of me, familiar yet strange, like I was seeing it for the first time. I couldn't bring myself to get out of the car. "John," Mike said softly, "you're going to be okay. It doesn't feel like it now, but you will be. Just take it one step at a time." I nodded, even though I didn't believe him. How could I be okay after this? How could anything ever be okay again? but I knew I had to face it, sooner or later. So I took a deep breath, opened the car door, and stepped out into the night. "Thanks, Mike," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I'd do without you." He gave me a sad smile. "You'll get through this, John. Just remember, you're not alone." I nodded, but as I walked toward the house, the weight of the truth settled even heavier on my shoulders. I was alone, more alone than I'd ever been. And I had no idea what to do next. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. My head was pounding, and my eyes felt raw, but I forced myself out of bed. I had to confront this, to get to the bottom of what was happening with Mary and Steve. I knew I couldn't just let it go, couldn't pretend everything was fine while my heart was bleeding inside. Mike called me around 9 a.m. "You okay?" he asked, his voice full of concern. "No," I answered honestly. "I'm not. But I need to know more, Mike. I can't confront her without knowing the whole story." Mike paused for a moment, then said, "All right, I get it. Look, we can do this, but we need to be careful. If you want to know what's going on, we'll need to set up some surveillance. Are you up for that?" Surveillance. The word made my skin crawl. I never thought I'd be the type of man who would spy on his wife, but here I was. "Yeah," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. "I'm up for it. I need to know everything." "Okay," Mike said, sounding more resolved. "Let's get some equipment. Cameras, recorders, whatever we need. I know a guy who can get us set up without too much hassle." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "All right. Let's do it." By midday, we were driving to a small electronics store on the edge of town. Mike's friend, a wiry guy named Tom, ran the place. He was used to handling discreet requests, and he didn't ask too many questions when Mike explained what we needed. He just nodded and began pulling things off the shelves: tiny cameras, motion sensors, a digital recorder, and a few other gadgets I didn't recognize. "This should do the trick," Tom said, packing everything into a nondescript black bag. "Just be careful where you set these up. Make sure they're hidden well, and don't forget to turn them off when you're around. You don't want to catch yourself on camera, do you?" Mike thanked him, paid in cash, and we left, the weight of the equipment heavy in my hands. As we got back into the car, I felt a mix of determination and guilt. I didn't like what I was doing, but I felt like I didn't have a choice. I needed proof. I needed to see it with my own eyes. We drove back to the house, and Mike helped me set up the cameras. We started in the living room, carefully placing one behind a bookshelf, angled just right to capture the whole room. Another one in the kitchen, hidden on top of a cabinet. We installed a motion-activated recorder in the hallway, where I knew Mary often took her phone calls. Lastly, we set up a small camera in our bedroom, hidden among some decorative items on the dresser. "This should cover all the bases," Mike said, stepping back to admire our handiwork. "Now, all we can do is wait." Waiting. That was the hardest part. Knowing that my life was hanging in the balance, that the truth would soon be laid bare. I felt sick to my stomach, but there was no turning back now. Over the next few days, I forced myself to act normal, to pretend that everything was fine, even though my insides were churning. Mary came home from Charleston on Sunday evening, as planned. She seemed tired, but otherwise normal. She kissed me on the cheek, told me she'd had a great time with her friends, and went straight to bed, saying she had a headache. I watched her closely, looking for any sign of guilt or remorse. But she seemed calm, almost relieved. I wanted to ask her about the trip, to see if she'd lie to my face, but I held back. I needed to play the long game, to wait until I had everything I needed. The first night after she returned, I hardly slept. I kept thinking about the cameras, wondering what they might capture, what secrets they might reveal. I tried not to let my mind wander to dark places, but it was no use. I kept imagining her with Steve, replaying the scene I'd seen through the window, over and over again. The next morning, Mary left early for work, saying she had an important meeting. As soon as she was out the door, I rushed to check the recordings. My hands trembled as I clicked through the footage, my heart pounding in my chest. The kitchen camera had caught her on the phone the previous night, talking quietly, her voice soft but tense. I turned up the volume, straining to hear. "Yes, it went fine," I heard her say, her tone low. "No, he doesn't suspect anything. Just relax, okay? We'll talk soon." I felt a surge of anger and despair. She was lying to me, plain and simple. I kept listening, but she didn't mention any names. I could feel the sweat on my forehead, my fingers twitching as I rewound the footage, trying to catch every word. I didn't hear much else that gave me any clues, but it was enough. She was hiding something, and she was talking to someone. I knew in my gut who it was. The following day, I called Mike again. "We have to do more," I said, my voice hard with determination. "We need to follow her, see where she's going. I can't live like this, Mike. I need to know the whole truth." Mike agreed, his voice steady. "All right, John. I'll help you. We'll get to the bottom of this. But remember, whatever we find, you need to be ready for it. You need to be prepared for what comes next." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "I will be," I replied, though my voice was shaky. "I have to be." The plan was set. We were going to follow her. And I knew, deep down, that whatever we found out in the next few days would change my life forever. Mike and I agreed to follow Mary after work the next day. My nerves were shot, but I was determined. I felt like a man walking a tightrope, knowing there was no net below to catch me if I fell. I needed to know what was really going on, even if it meant tearing my life apart. Mary left the house around 8 a.m., her usual time. I watched her through the window as she got into her car, dressed smartly for work, looking every bit like the wife I thought I knew. I waited for her to disappear down the street before grabbing my keys and heading out to meet Mike. We parked a couple of blocks away from her office, keeping a safe distance. "Okay," Mike said, checking his watch. "We just wait now. She usually leaves around 5, right?" I nodded, my stomach churning. "Yeah, unless she's got one of those meetings." We sat in the car, trying to keep ourselves occupied, but it was impossible. Every minute felt like an hour. I kept glancing at the clock on the dashboard, my heart racing. I tried to make small talk, but Mike knew better than to push me into conversation. Finally, at just past 5, Mary emerged from the building. She was smiling, looking down at her phone. I could feel my pulse quicken as I saw her type something quickly and then slip the phone back into her purse. She headed straight for her car, and we waited until she pulled out of the lot before we started the engine and followed at a safe distance. "She's heading downtown," Mike murmured, eyes focused on the road ahead. "Think she's meeting him?" "Maybe," I said, though I felt certain in my gut. "Just keep your distance, and don't lose her." We trailed her through the city streets, past shops and restaurants, until she turned onto a quieter road that led out of town. My palms were sweating, my mind racing with possibilities. And then I saw it, the turnoff for a small, secluded villa just outside the city. My heart sank. I knew this place. It was the same villa from Charleston. A wave of nausea rolled over me as Mary pulled up to the gated entrance and waited. Moments later, a familiar car pulled in behind her. Steve's car. I gripped the edge of my seat, trying to stay calm, but inside, I was boiling over with anger and hurt. "There he is," Mike muttered, shaking his head. "That son of a..." I put a hand up to stop him. "Let's just watch," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. Steve got out of his car and walked up to Mary's. He leaned down to her window, said something I couldn't hear, and then laughed. She laughed too, that light, carefree laugh I'd seen through the window before. My heart clenched. He opened the gate, and they both drove inside. "Let's go," I said to Mike, my voice hard. "We need to get closer." We parked the car a little way down the road and slipped out, moving quietly through the trees that bordered the villa's grounds. We crept along the fence line, trying to stay hidden, my heart pounding in my chest. I could see the big glass windows of the villa up ahead, just like before. We found a spot behind some bushes, out of sight but close enough to see inside. I felt my breath catch as I looked through the window. Mary and Steve were sitting on the couch, close together, their hands touching. I could see the way he looked at her, the way she smiled back at him. They were talking, but I couldn't hear what they were saying. Then, slowly, he leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a friendly peck, it was deep and passionate. Her hand reached up to his face, pulling him closer. My heart shattered into pieces. I felt a rush of blood to my head, a wave of heat washing over me. I wanted to scream, to burst in and rip them apart, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, paralyzed by the reality of what I was seeing. Mary stood up, and they moved toward the stairs, still kissing. Steve's hands were on her waist, her hips, pulling her close. I could see her whisper something in his ear, and they both laughed softly before disappearing from view, heading upstairs. I felt my knees buckle, and I grabbed onto the fence for support. I was shaking, my hands clammy with sweat, my breathing ragged. Mike put a hand on my shoulder. "John," he whispered urgently, "we need to go. You can't do this to yourself." But I couldn't tear my eyes away from the house. My wife, my Mary, was upstairs with him, doing things I couldn't bear to imagine. The woman I'd loved for 25 years was betraying me in the most intimate way, and I felt like I was being ripped in half. Finally, I nodded. "You're right," I croaked, my voice barely a whisper. "We need to get out of here." We made our way back to the car in silence, the weight of what I'd just seen settling like a stone in my chest. I felt numb, hollow, like I'd been gutted from the inside out. When we got back to the car, I sank into the passenger seat, my head in my hands. "What now?" Mike asked softly, his voice filled with concern. I didn't know. I didn't have a single clue. All I knew was that everything had changed. Everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, my future, it was all gone, shattered like glass. I had seen the truth, and it was worse than anything I'd ever imagined. "I have to confront her," I finally whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "I can't pretend anymore. I need to hear it from her." Mike nodded. "Okay. But take your time, John. Don't do anything you'll regret. Just, be careful." I nodded, but inside, I felt like a storm was brewing. I wasn't sure I could control it for much longer. The drive home felt like a blur. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Mike sat beside me in silence, sensing that words would only make things worse. I was trying to stay calm, trying to keep my emotions in check, but my mind was racing with images I couldn't erase. Mary with Steve, her laughter, their kiss, the way she looked at him like she'd never looked at me. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I was shaking with anger and hurt. I could barely breathe. I sat there for a moment, staring at the front door, knowing that just behind it was the woman who had shattered my world. I had thought about this moment 100 times, but now that it was here, I felt completely unprepared. Mike put a hand on my arm. "John, listen to me," he said quietly. "Don't go in there and lose your head. I know you're angry, but you've got to keep it together. Hear her out. Get the truth. Then decide what you want to do." I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, okay," I muttered, though I didn't feel okay at all. I stepped out of the car and walked up to the door, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. My hand trembled as I turned the key in the lock, pushing the door open with more force than I intended. I saw Mary standing in the kitchen, her back to me. She turned around, surprised to see me home so early. "John," she said, her voice light, but I could hear a hint of nervousness beneath it. "I wasn't expecting you back so soon." I looked at her, really looked at her, and something in me snapped. "Where were you today, Mary?" I asked, my voice low and tight. She hesitated for just a second before responding. "At work, of course." "Why?" I felt my anger surge. I stepped closer, my hands clenched into fists. "Don't lie to me," I spat, unable to hold back. I know where you were. I saw you. I followed you. Her eyes widened, and she took a step back, her face turning pale. John, what are you talking about? I'm talking about you and Steve, I shouted, my voice breaking. I saw you, Mary. I saw you with him at that villa. I saw everything. Her face crumpled, and for a moment, she just stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like she couldn't find the words. Then, finally, she whispered, I'm so sorry, John. I never meant for you to find out like this. I laughed bitterly, a sound that felt foreign in my own mouth. Find out like this? How the hell did you expect me to find out, Mary? Were you ever going to tell me? Or were you just planning to keep sneaking around with him behind my back? Tears welled up in her eyes, and she took a shaky breath. It's not like that, John, she pleaded. It just happened. I was lonely. You've been so distant lately, so wrapped up in your own world, and Steve, he was there. He listened to me. He made me feel wanted again. Her words hit me like a slap in the face. So, it's my fault, then? I snapped. I wasn't enough for you, so you went and found someone else to make you feel special? No, John, that's not what I'm saying, she cried, reaching out to touch my arm. I pulled away, my skin crawling. I'm just trying to explain how I felt. I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I shook my head, anger and pain coursing through me. How far did it go, Mary? Just tell me. How long has this been happening? She looked down, wiping her tears. A few months, she whispered. It started with the golf lessons, then the trips. I don't know, John. I got caught up. I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. A few months, I repeated, stunned. All those late nights, those work trips, you were with him? She nodded, and I saw fresh tears spill down her cheeks. Yes, she admitted, her voice small. But it didn't mean. I couldn't listen to her anymore. I felt the walls closing in around me, the air growing thick. Stop, I cut her off, holding up a hand. Just stop. I don't want to hear it. I can't. I can't do this. She started sobbing, her shoulders shaking. John, please. I know I messed up. I'm so sorry. I'll do anything to make it right. I love you, I really do. I want to fix this, to fix us. I felt a surge of bitterness rise in my throat. You love me? I laughed harshly. If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this. You wouldn't have lied, over and over again. Mary sank to her knees, her hands clasped together like she was praying. Please, John. Don't leave me. I'm begging you. I know I've hurt you, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right. Just give me a chance. I stared at her, feeling torn apart. A part of me wanted to believe her, wanted to forgive her and try to rebuild what we had. But another part, a bigger part, was filled with a deep, searing pain that wouldn't let go. I don't know, Mary, I said finally, my voice hollow. I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can ever trust you again. She cried harder, her sobs echoing through the house. Please, John. Please just give me a chance. Don't throw away everything we've built. I'll do anything. Anything. I stood there, feeling the weight of her words pressing down on me. I wanted to scream, to run, to disappear and never have to deal with this again. But I knew that wasn't an option. I had to decide. I had to figure out what came next. And I had no idea where to start. Mary stayed on her knees, her face streaked with tears, pleading with me, but all I felt was emptiness. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw a stranger, a woman who had betrayed me, who had lied to me over and over again. I didn't know how to feel. Anger, sadness, betrayal, confusion, it was all there, swirling inside me like a storm that wouldn't settle. Get up, Mary, I finally said, my voice flat, almost lifeless. Stop begging. I need some space to think. She got up slowly, wiping her face with the back of her hand, and nodded. I understand, she whispered. I'll give you all the time you need, John. Just, please don't make any rash decisions. We can work through this, I know we can. I felt a flare of anger at her words. Work through this? I repeated, almost incredulous. How exactly do you think we're going to work through you sleeping with another man? How do we come back from that, Mary? You tell me, because I have no idea. She winced at the harshness in my voice but didn't back down. I know I broke your trust, she said, her voice trembling. But I swear, it didn't mean I stopped loving you. I got lost, John. I felt invisible, like I didn't matter to you anymore. And then Steve, he made me feel seen again. Seen? I snapped. I was right here, Mary. I was always right here. You could have talked to me, told me how you felt. Instead, you chose to run to him. You chose to betray everything we had, everything we built. Her face crumpled again, and she nodded. You're right, she whispered, her voice broken. I should have come to you. I should have talked to you. I don't know why I didn't. I'm sorry, John, I'm so sorry. I shook my head, feeling like I was going to explode. Sorry? Sorry doesn't even begin to cover it, Mary. Do you have any idea what it feels like to see the woman you've loved for 25 years with another man? To watch her lie to your face, over and over again? You've torn me apart. I feel like I'm losing my mind here. Mary took a step closer, reaching out for me, but I pulled away. John, I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I'll cut off all contact with Steve, I'll go to therapy, counseling, anything. Just please, don't throw us away. I let out a bitter laugh. Us? I asked, my voice dripping with sarcasm. You already threw us away the second you decided he was worth more than your own husband. Her face twisted with pain, and she sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. I know, she sobbed. I know, and I hate myself for it. I've been so stupid, so selfish. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm asking for it anyway. I'm begging you, John. Please. I turned away, my eyes burning with unshed tears. I didn't want to see her cry. I didn't want to hear her apologies. I wanted to rewind time, to go back to before I knew, before everything fell apart. But there was no going back. Only forward, into a future I didn't recognize. I need to get out of here, I muttered, heading for the door. I need to think. John, please don't leave, Mary cried, her voice frantic. Just stay. We can talk. Talk? I cut her off, my voice rising. I don't want to talk, Mary. I want to scream. I want to break something. I want to know why you chose him over me, over everything we had. And don't tell me it's because I made you feel invisible. That's not an excuse for what you did. She flinched at my words, her shoulders trembling with each sob. I know, she whispered. I know, and I'm so sorry. I was weak, John. I was stupid. I got caught up in something that never should have happened. But I do love you, I swear I do. Then why didn't you come to me? I shouted, feeling my voice crack. Why didn't you try to fix things with me instead of running to him? She looked up, her eyes filled with pain. I don't know, she admitted. I was scared. Scared of what you'd say, scared you wouldn't care. I felt alone, John. And I know that's not an excuse. I know I messed up. But I don't want to lose you. I stood there, staring at her, feeling 1,000 emotions at once. I wanted to scream, to cry, to grab her and shake her until she understood the depth of what she'd done. But all I could do was stand there, feeling lost. I need time, I finally said, my voice quiet. I need time to figure out if I can even look at you again without seeing him. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. Take all the time you need, she whispered. I'll be here, waiting. "I'll do anything, John. Anything to fix this." I didn't respond. I just turned and walked out the door, feeling the cold air hit my face like a slap. I got in my car, gripping the steering wheel, and stared at the house. The place where I had built my life, the place that had once felt like home. Now, it felt like a prison, filled with ghosts of broken promises. I didn't know where to go, what to do. All I knew was that I couldn't go back inside. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I started the car and pulled out of the driveway, not looking back. I drove aimlessly for hours, trying to outrun the pain, but it stayed with me, clinging to my skin like a second layer. I felt like I was drifting in a sea of doubt, not knowing where the shore was, or if I'd ever reach it again. And the worst part was, I wasn't sure if I even wanted to. I don't remember much of the drive, just that it felt like I was running on autopilot, turning down roads I'd driven 100 times but barely recognizing them now. My mind was a mess, replaying every word Mary had said, every excuse she'd made. I couldn't make sense of any of it, couldn't find a way to understand why she'd done this to me, to us. Somehow, without really deciding, I ended up in front of my brother Jim's house. He lived on the other side of town, a good 30-minute drive, but it felt like I'd gotten there in seconds. I turned off the car and sat there, staring at his front door, feeling like I was 16 again, needing his help to get out of some stupid mess I'd made. But this mess was different. This wasn't something he could fix with a few tough words or a friendly slap on the back. Still, I needed someone to talk to, someone who might have an answer I couldn't see myself. I climbed out of the car and walked up to his door, feeling the cool night air on my skin. I knocked softly at first, then harder when I realized he probably couldn't hear it over the sound of the TV inside. A moment later, the door swung open, and Jim stood there, a beer in his hand, a look of surprise on his face. "John," he said, frowning. "What are you doing here?" "It's late, man." I tried to smile, but it felt weak and forced. "I know. I needed to talk." He took one look at my face and knew something was wrong. He stepped aside, waving me in. "Come on in." "What happened?" I stepped inside, and the familiar smell of his house hit me, beer, old wood, and the faint scent of his cologne. It was comforting in a way I hadn't expected. He led me into the living room and handed me a beer without asking, then sat down in his old recliner, motioning for me to take a seat on the couch. I sat down, the cold beer sweating in my hand, and took a deep breath. "It's Mary," I began, my voice cracking a little. She's been cheating on me, Jim. With some guy named Steve." Jim didn't react immediately, just sat there, his expression calm but his eyes sharp, like he was taking it all in. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and let out a long sigh. "Damn, John. I'm sorry to hear that. Really, I am. That's rough." I nodded, feeling my throat tighten again. "I don't know what to do," I admitted. "She says she's sorry, that she wants to fix things, but I don't know if I can. I don't know if I should." Jim took a sip of his beer, then set it down on the table. "I get it, man. I really do. It's not an easy thing to figure out. But let me ask you this, do you still love her?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I sat there, staring at the beer in my hand, not sure how to answer. Did I still love her? I thought about all the years we'd spent together, the memories we'd made, the life we'd built. But then I thought about her and Steve, about the lies, the betrayal, the look on her face when I'd confronted her. It was all tangled up together, and I couldn't see the line between love and pain anymore. I think I do," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't know if that's enough anymore. How do I forgive her, Jim? How do I trust her again?" Jim nodded slowly, like he understood exactly what I was feeling. "Look, John," he began, "I've been through this, remember? When Lisa cheated on me, I thought my whole world had ended. I was angry, hurt, just like you. But you know what helped me decide? I asked myself if I could see a future without her, if I could really imagine my life without her in it. I listened, hanging on his every word. And I realized I couldn't, he continued. As much as she'd hurt me, as much as I felt betrayed, I still loved her. And I knew if I walked away, I'd regret it for the rest of my life. So I decided to give it a shot, to try to forgive and rebuild. I nodded slowly, thinking about his words. But how did you do it? How did you get past it? He smiled sadly. It wasn't easy, trust me. It took time, a lot of time. We went to counseling, talked through every damn thing, fought like hell some days. But we both wanted it. We both wanted to try. And that's the key, John. If you both want it, if you're both willing to put in the work, there's a chance. But if one of you isn't, well, then it's just not going to happen. I stared at him, feeling a little glimmer of hope, but also a deep sense of fear. What if I try, and I can't get over it? I asked quietly. What if I just keep seeing them together every time I look at her? Jim sighed again, his eyes softening. Then at least you tried, brother. At least you know you gave it everything you had. But if you walk away now, without giving it a chance, you'll never know. And that's a different kind of pain, one that eats away at you, because you're always wondering what could have been. I nodded, swallowing hard. I don't know, Jim. I really don't know if I can. He leaned forward, his expression serious. You don't have to decide right now, John. Take your time. But talk to her. See if she's really willing to fight for it. If she is, and if you are, then maybe, just maybe, you can find a way through this. But if she's not, then you'll know. I nodded again, feeling a little lighter, like maybe there was a path forward, even if I couldn't see it clearly yet. Thanks, Jim, I said softly. I needed to hear that. He gave me a small smile. Anytime, brother. You're not alone in this. Just remember that. I sat there for a while longer, talking with Jim, feeling the weight of his words settle in. He'd been where I was, and he'd made it through to the other side. Maybe I could, too. Maybe there was a way to find my way back to something that felt like home. But I knew it wouldn't be easy. It would take everything I had, and maybe more than I could give. As I left Jim's house that night, I still didn't know what I was going to do, but at least I knew I had a choice to make. A hard, painful choice that would shape the rest of my life. And I prayed I'd find the strength to make the right one. Driving home from Jim's place, my mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. I appreciated his advice, his perspective on trying to rebuild what was broken, but part of me wasn't ready to even consider forgiveness. The anger was still too raw, the betrayal too fresh. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them together, Mary and Steve, and the pain sliced through me like a knife. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. The house was silent, but my mind was loud, filled with the echo of Mary's apologies, her desperate pleas for another chance. But all I could think about was how she had lied to me, how she had betrayed everything we had built together. By the time morning came, my exhaustion was mixed with a simmering anger. I got up, paced the house, tried to clear my head, but nothing worked. I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of it all. I knew I couldn't keep living like this, something had to give. As I made coffee, I remembered a conversation I'd had with Mike a while back, during a different tough time in my life. He'd told me something that had stuck with me, something about how sometimes, the best way to deal with pain is to channel it into something productive. I wasn't sure if what I was thinking now was productive, but it was definitely something. The idea planted itself in my mind, growing roots in the fertile soil of my anger and hurt. I didn't just want to confront Mary, I wanted her to feel the same pain she'd caused me. And as for Steve, well, he was going to regret ever coming into our lives. I spent the next few hours planning, sketching out ideas in my mind, thinking about how I could make them pay. It wasn't enough just to expose the affair, I wanted to humiliate them, to bring their little world crashing down. I wanted everyone to know what they had done, to see them for the liars and cheats they were. By midday, I had a plan. I wasn't proud of it, but it felt like the only way to regain some control, to take back the power that had been stripped from me when I found out about the affair. It was petty, maybe even cruel, but I didn't care. I was too hurt to care. I called Mike, feeling a rush of adrenaline as I waited for him to pick up. "Hey, Mike," I said when he answered. "I need your help with something." He hesitated for a moment. "John, what's going on? You sound different." "I've decided what I'm going to do," I told him, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I'm going to expose them. I'm going to make sure everyone knows what they did." There was a long pause on the other end. "John, are you sure that's the right move? I mean, I get it, you're angry, but revenge, it's a dangerous road, man. You could end up hurting yourself more than them." "I don't care," I snapped, the words coming out harsher than I intended. "I need to do this, Mike. I can't just sit back and let them get away with it. They need to pay." Mike sighed deeply. "All right, John. If you're set on this, I'll help. What's the plan?" I laid it out for him, my voice growing more confident as I spoke. "Steve and Mary have been meeting at that villa for months. I know when they're planning to go there next, they've got a date set for this Friday. What I want to do is make sure that everyone around them knows what's going on. I want to catch them in the act and make sure it gets back to everyone they care about." Mike listened quietly, then said, "You're talking about setting them up, getting some evidence, and spreading it around?" "Exactly," I said, feeling a twisted satisfaction as the plan took shape. "I'll invite a few of our mutual friends over, make sure they're nearby when it all goes down. I want to make it public, make sure there's no way they can talk their way out of it." Mike was silent for a moment. "John, this is a big step. Once you do this, there's no going back. Are you sure you want to drag other people into it?" "I need to," I replied, my voice firm. "It's the only way I can make them feel the way I'm feeling right now. They need to understand the consequences of their actions." Mike sighed again, but I could hear the resignation in his voice. "All right. I'll help you set it up. But just, be careful, okay? This kind of thing can spiral out of control fast." "I will," I promised, even though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. The next few days passed in a blur. I felt like I was living on adrenaline, my mind racing with thoughts of revenge. Every time I pictured Mary and Steve together, I felt that familiar surge of anger, and it kept me going, pushing me forward. Friday came faster than I expected. I spent the morning setting everything up, making sure all the pieces were in place. I invited a few of our friends over under the guise of a casual get-together, something Mary would never suspect. I told them to meet me near the villa, making up some excuse about wanting to show them a property I was thinking of buying. They didn't question it, they trusted me. When Mary left the house that afternoon, I followed her, keeping a safe distance. My heart was pounding, my hands sweating as I watched her drive to the villa. Steve was already there, waiting for her. I felt a sharp pain in my chest, but I pushed it aside. This was it. This was the moment I had been planning for. I met up with our friends a few blocks away, leading them toward the villa with a forced smile. "You're going to love this place," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "It's got a great view, really private." As we approached the villa, I could feel my heart racing. I knew what was about to happen, and part of me was terrified. But another part, a darker part, felt a sick satisfaction at the thought of what was coming. We reached the villa, and I led them around to the side, where we had a clear view through the large glass windows. My hands were trembling as I gestured for them to look. "There it is," I said, my voice hollow. "Take a look." They all turned to see Mary and Steve inside, laughing, holding each other close, oblivious to the eyes watching them. I saw the shock on my friends' faces, the realization dawning as they pieced it together. My heart pounded in my chest as I waited for the inevitable. What the hell is this?" one of them whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. I didn't answer. I just watched, feeling a twisted sense of victory as the truth unfolded before their eyes. Mary and Steve were caught, exposed for what they were. There was no going back now. The damage was done. But as I stood there, watching the scene play out, a cold emptiness began to settle over me. The satisfaction I had expected didn't come. Instead, all I felt was a deep, gnawing ache in my chest, a realization that this was just the beginning of the pain, not the end. As my friends began to back away, muttering in shock and confusion, I realized that revenge hadn't given me what I wanted. It hadn't brought me closure, hadn't made the pain go away. It had only deepened the wound, turning it into something even darker. I watched as Mary and Steve finally noticed us, their faces going pale with horror as they saw the group standing outside the window. Steve pulled away from her, his expression twisting with fear and anger. Mary's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and betrayal as she realized what I had done. For a moment, our eyes met, and I saw the depth of her pain, her regret. And in that instant, I knew I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. I had become something else, someone I didn't recognize. I turned away, unable to look at her any longer, and walked back toward the car, leaving the shattered pieces of my life behind me. Revenge hadn't given me what I wanted. It had only shown me. The drive home felt like it took forever, but in reality, it was just minutes. The adrenaline that had fueled me through the day was crashing, leaving me with nothing but a hollow, gnawing sense of regret. I had imagined that exposing Mary and Steve would somehow make me feel vindicated, but it had only deepened the wound, making it clear that the path I had chosen was not the one to healing. When I got home, the house was dark and quiet. I walked inside, the echo of my footsteps the only sound, and for the first time, the emptiness hit me hard. This house, once filled with laughter, love, and shared moments, felt like a tomb. The place where my marriage had lived and now, it seemed, where it had died. I sat down on the couch, the same couch where Mary and I had spent countless evenings together, talking, watching TV, just being with each other. Now, all those memories felt tainted, overshadowed by what had happened. I buried my face in my hands, the enormity of what I'd done crashing down on me. Was this really the end? Was there no way back from here? An hour later, I heard the front door creak open. I looked up to see Mary standing there, her face pale, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She stepped inside cautiously, as if she wasn't sure if she was welcome anymore. I didn't say anything, I wasn't sure I could. She walked over and sat down on the edge of the couch, keeping a distance between us. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence was thick, filled with everything we needed to say but didn't know how to begin. Finally, she broke the silence, her voice small and trembling. "John," she started, barely above a whisper, "I'm so sorry. For everything. For what I did, for how I hurt you, and for today. I never meant for it to come to this." I looked at her, trying to find the words. "Why, Mary?" I asked, my voice heavy with pain. "Why did you do it? And why him? Was I not enough?" She shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "It was never about you not being enough," she said, her voice cracking. "I was the one who wasn't enough, for myself. I lost who I was, John. I got caught up in feeling like I needed something more, something different, and I didn't realize what I had until I almost lost it." I looked away, the weight of her words pressing down on me. "And now? What do you want now, Mary? Because I honestly don't know if we can come back from this." She inched closer, reaching out tentatively to touch my hand. "I want to try, John. I want to fix this, to make it right. I know I don't deserve it, and I know I've broken your trust, but I want to fight for us, if you're willing to give me a chance." I pulled my hand away, not ready to bridge that gap just yet. "You say that now, but what happens in a month? A year? How do I know you won't do this again, that you won't look for something different the next time you feel lost?" She flinched at my words, but she didn't back down. "I can't promise you that I'll be perfect, John. I can't promise that I won't make mistakes again. But I can promise that I'll never stop trying. I'll never stop fighting for you, for us. I'll go to therapy, we can go to counseling together, whatever it takes. But please, just give me a chance to prove it to you." Her words hung in the air, and I could feel the desperation in them, the sincerity. But I was still so hurt, so angry. Could I really forgive her? Could I ever look at her the same way again? "I don't know, Mary," I said finally, my voice thick with emotion. "I don't know if I can forgive you. I don't know if I can get past this. I want to, part of me wants to, but the other part just wants to forget everything." She nodded, her eyes filled with a sadness that matched my own. "I understand," she whispered. "And if you decide you can't, I'll have to live with that. But I'm asking you, John, please, don't throw away what we had without at least trying." The room fell silent again, and I could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on me. This was it, this was the moment where I had to choose. Walk away and leave everything behind, or stay and try to rebuild what had been shattered. I looked at Mary, the woman I had loved for so long, the woman who had hurt me more than I ever thought possible. And in that moment, I realized that despite everything, despite the betrayal and the pain, I still loved her. The thought of losing her completely was something I wasn't ready to face, not yet. "All right," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "All right, Mary. We'll try. But I'm not making any promises. This is going to take a long time, and I don't know if we'll make it. But if you're willing to fight, then so am I." She let out a breath she didn't seem to realize she was holding and moved closer, taking my hand in hers again. "Thank you, John," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. "I know this won't be easy, but I'm not giving up on us. Not ever." I nodded, though I still wasn't sure if I believed her. But for now, it was enough to know that we were both willing to try. As we sat there in the silence of our broken home, I felt the first glimmer of hope, small and fragile, but there. Maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. But it would take time, and a lot of work. And even then, I knew there were no guarantees. All we had was the chance to try, to see if there was still something worth saving in the ashes of what we once had. The next few weeks felt like walking through a minefield. Every day was a new test of patience, trust, and forgiveness. Mary and I were trying to find our footing again, but every step forward felt like 2 steps back. Some days were better than others. There were moments where we laughed over something small, shared a meal without awkward silences, or just sat together on the porch like we used to, watching the sun dip below the horizon. For a brief second, it felt almost normal. But then there were the other days, the hard ones. The days when a simple comment or glance would trigger a wave of doubt, anger, or insecurity. We started seeing a marriage counselor, a kind woman named Dr. Harris. She had a soft voice and a way of making me feel like it was okay to be angry, that it was okay to be confused. She listened as we both spoke, often over each other, sometimes not at all, and slowly, she began to guide us through the tangled mess we'd made of our marriage. "I'm not asking you to forget," she told me in one session. "Forgetting is unrealistic. What I'm asking is if you can learn to live with it, to find a way to move forward despite the pain." I wasn't sure if I could. Every time I looked at Mary, I saw flashes of her with Steve. I imagined their time together, the stolen moments, the laughter they shared. It was like a poison that seeped into my mind, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't fully shake it. Mary tried, too. I could see the effort she was making, trying to be transparent about her every move, her every thought. She was patient when I was distant, kind when I lashed out. I could see the guilt weighing on her, the desperation in her eyes whenever we talked. She'd check in constantly, telling me where she was, who she was with, even if I hadn't asked. And slowly, ever so slowly, it started to make a difference. But there were days I wondered if I was just fooling myself, clinging to the remnants of a marriage that had already died. I was haunted by the uncertainty of it all, the what-ifs that kept me awake at night. What if she did it again? What if we couldn't make it work? What if I was making a mistake by staying? One night, after another tense session with Dr. Harris, we came home and sat in the living room, the silence stretching between us like an ocean. I stared at the wall, my thoughts churning, and Mary sat beside me, wringing her hands. Finally, she spoke. "John," she said softly, "I know you're still hurting, and I know this has been hard on you. But, do you think there's any hope for us?" I turned to look at her. She looked so fragile, so worn down by the weight of everything that had happened. And in that moment, I saw not just the woman who had betrayed me, but also the woman I'd loved for so many years. The woman who had been my partner, my confidant, my everything. "I don't know, Mary," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "I honestly don't know. But I think I want there to be. I think I'm willing to keep trying, as long as you are." She reached out and took my hand, her fingers trembling. "I am," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "I promise you, John. I'm in this, all the way. I'll do whatever it takes." We sat there for a long time, holding each other's hands, letting the silence speak for us. I felt a small flicker of hope, a tiny spark that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back. The following weeks brought more counseling sessions, more long talks, more attempts to rebuild trust. We started doing things together again, simple things like going for a walk, cooking dinner, or just sitting on the porch, talking about our day. Each small step felt monumental, each laugh a victory. One afternoon, while cleaning the attic, I stumbled across an old photo album, pictures from the early years of our marriage. I sat on the dusty floor, flipping through the pages, seeing the faces of two people who had once been so happy, so full of promise. I felt a wave of nostalgia, a longing for those days before everything got complicated. I realized that we had once been good together, that there had been so much love between us. And maybe, just maybe, there could be again. That evening, I showed the album to Mary. We sat on the living room floor, side by side, looking at the photos, remembering the moments. We laughed at our younger selves, at the clothes we wore, the hairstyles we thought were so cool. We cried a little, too, for the things we'd lost along the way, for the mistakes we'd made. "We were so young," Mary whispered, tracing her fingers over a picture of us at the beach, our arms around each other, grinning at the camera. "We had no idea what was ahead." "No," I agreed, feeling a lump in my throat. "We didn't." We fell silent again, flipping through more pages. I could feel a shift in the room, a softening. The anger, the bitterness, it was still there, but it felt less sharp, less all-consuming. "Maybe we can find a way back to that," Mary said softly, almost as if she were afraid to hope. "Maybe," I replied, feeling that small flicker of hope again. "Maybe we can." Over time, things slowly began to change. There were still hard days, days where the doubts crept back in, where I wondered if I was being a fool. But there were also good days, days where we laughed together, shared a meal, or just sat quietly, feeling like a team again. Mary kept her promise. She cut all ties with Steve, blocked his number, and changed her routine. She made a point to be open with me, to share her thoughts and feelings. And I tried, too. I tried to let go of the anger, to see her as the woman I loved, not the woman who had hurt me. It wasn't easy. In fact, it was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. But slowly, little by little, I began to feel the cracks starting to heal. One night, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, I reached for her hand. She looked over at me, surprised, and then smiled, squeezing my fingers tightly. "We're going to be okay, John," she whispered, as if saying it out loud would make it true. "Yeah," I replied, feeling the warmth of her hand in mine. "I think we just might be." And for the first time in a long while, I felt like maybe, just maybe, we had a chance. A chance to start over, to rebuild, to find something new in the ashes of what had been. It wouldn't be the same, it could never be the same. But maybe, just maybe, it could be something worth fighting for. Something that was worth all the pain, all the hurt, all the struggle. A new beginning. And I was willing to see where it led. As the weeks turned into months, Mary and I continued to navigate the uneasy waters of our reconciliation. It was like learning to dance again, but with different music, awkward at times, clumsy even, but slowly becoming more familiar with each step. We had to learn each other all over again, rediscover who we were after the wreckage. Mary was committed, I could see that every day. She poured herself into our marriage like she was trying to fix something that had been shattered, one piece at a time. She'd leave little notes for me around the house, just like she used to when we first got married. Thinking of you on the bathroom mirror. You're my favorite in my lunch bag. I'm sorry under my pillow. At first, I didn't know how to respond. I didn't trust it, didn't trust her. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for her to go back to her old ways, or for me to wake up one morning and realize that it had all been a mistake. But the days went by, and she kept at it, proving in small ways that she was still here, still fighting. I found myself softening, almost against my will. I still had moments when the anger would flare up, when I would see her texting on her phone and feel a stab of doubt. But then I'd remember how hard she was trying, how much she seemed to want to make it right. And I'd remind myself that if I wanted to heal, I needed to let some of that anger go. One weekend, she suggested we get out of town for a bit. Just a day trip, she said, somewhere we've never been. No plans, no expectations. Just us. I hesitated, the idea of being alone with her outside of our routines still made me anxious. But I could see the hope in her eyes, the way she was trying to reach out, to bridge the gap that had grown between us. All right, I agreed, let's do it. We drove out to a small town a few hours away, a place neither of us had ever visited. It was quiet, peaceful, the kind of place where time seemed to slow down. We wandered through antique shops, ate lunch at a little cafe on the main street, and just talked, really talked, for the first time in what felt like years. She told me about her childhood, stories I'd heard 100 times, but with new details I hadn't known. I shared things I'd never really talked about, little pieces of myself that I'd kept tucked away. We laughed at silly things, shared comfortable silences, and for a few moments, it felt like we were two people falling in love again. As we walked down a tree-lined path by a small river, she slipped her hand into mine, a tentative move. I felt a jolt of electricity at her touch, that old familiar sensation that had once been so automatic, so easy. I glanced over at her, and she smiled, softly, tentatively. "Thank you for giving us this chance, John," she whispered. "I know it's been hard. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm grateful." I squeezed her hand, looking down at the ground. "It's been hard, Mary," I admitted. "Some days, I'm not sure if we're going to make it. But I'm starting to believe it's worth trying for." She stopped walking and turned to face me, her eyes searching mine. "I love you," she said quietly. "I've always loved you. I just forgot how to show it. But I won't forget again. I promise." I looked at her, really looked at her, and I could see the sincerity in her eyes. The fear, the hope, the love that was still there, waiting to be rekindled. "I love you, too," I said, surprising even myself. It had been so long since I'd said those words, but they felt true. "And I'm willing to keep trying, for as long as it takes." She smiled, and I saw tears in her eyes, but this time they were happy tears. She pulled me into a hug, holding me tight, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like maybe things could be okay. Maybe we could find a new rhythm, a new way of being together. The drive back home was quiet, but it was a good quiet, the kind where words weren't necessary. We held hands, listening to the radio, the countryside rolling by. For the first time since the affair, I felt a sense of peace, a calm I hadn't known in months. When we got back, Mary suggested we make dinner together, something we hadn't done in years. We chopped vegetables, laughed about our terrible knife skills, and danced around each other in the kitchen, bumping hips and stealing little glances. It felt light, almost fun, like we were two kids playing house again. As we sat down to eat, she raised her glass, a shy smile on her face. "To new beginnings," she toasted. I clinked my glass against hers, a small smile tugging at my lips. "To new beginnings," I echoed. That night, as we lay in bed, Mary snuggled up next to me, her head on my shoulder. "I know we still have a long way to go," she whispered. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes, John. I mean it. I kissed her forehead, feeling a warmth spread through my chest. I know, I said softly. And I'm here, too. We're in this together. We still had a long road ahead of us, and I knew there would be more hard days, more moments of doubt. But for the first time, I felt a sense of hope, a sense that maybe we could find our way back to something good, something new. And as I drifted off to sleep that night, holding Mary close, I realized that I was ready to try, to really try. Because maybe, just maybe, some things were worth the fight. And maybe, just maybe, we were one of those things. The days turned into weeks, and Mary and I continued our slow dance back toward one another. It was a fragile thing, this new beginning. We were like two people walking on cracked ice, afraid to make the wrong step and shatter everything beneath us. But there was also a strange kind of beauty in it, like we were rediscovering parts of each other we hadn't seen in years. Rebuilding trust was the hardest part. I knew it wasn't going to be easy, but I hadn't realized just how many times a day I would be reminded of what happened. A text alert would go off on her phone, and I'd feel that spike of panic. I'd catch myself wondering where she was or who she was talking to, even though she had made a point of being more open with me than ever before. She gave me access to her phone, her email, even her social media accounts. I nodded, grateful for her honesty but still struggling with the reality of it all. I know you're trying, Mary, I replied. And I appreciate it. I really do. But it's going to take time. I can't just flip a switch and forget everything that happened. She reached across the table and took my hand. I know, she whispered. And I'm willing to wait as long as it takes. I'm not going anywhere. We sat there for a moment, holding hands, letting the silence stretch out between us. I could feel the sincerity in her words, the earnestness in her eyes. She meant it. She was trying, maybe harder than I'd ever seen her try for anything before. And it was beginning to matter. I could feel myself wanting to believe her, wanting to trust her again. But it was a slow process, and I knew there were no shortcuts. A few days later, Mary suggested we take a small step out of our comfort zone. Let's have dinner with some friends, she proposed. The ones who were there that day. I want them to see us together, to know that we're working through this. The idea made me uneasy. Those friends had seen the worst of us, had witnessed the ugliest parts of our relationship. But maybe that was the point. Maybe it was time to show them that we were still here, still fighting. All right, I agreed, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Let's do it. We chose a quiet little restaurant on the edge of town, the kind of place that didn't get too crowded. As we sat at the table, waiting for our friends to arrive, I felt my stomach knotting up. What would they say? What would they think? Would they judge us for trying to make it work, for not walking away? But when they arrived, I was surprised to see smiles on their faces, genuine smiles. They hugged us both, asked how we were doing, and didn't shy away from the obvious elephant in the room. We're so glad to see you two here, one of them said. It takes a lot of strength to face what you're facing and decide to stay. Mary squeezed my hand under the table, and I felt a small wave of relief. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad after all. The conversation was light, but honest. We didn't dwell on what had happened, but we didn't ignore it either. We talked about the counseling, about the things we were learning, about the small victories we'd had along the way. Our friends listened, offered encouragement, and I realized that I didn't have to carry the shame of what had happened alone. They were there for us, rooting for us, even in our brokenness. After dinner, as we walked back to the car, Mary slipped her hand into mine. That went better than I thought, she said, a hint of surprise in her voice. I nodded, feeling the same sense of cautious optimism. Yeah, I agreed. Maybe we're stronger than we think. She leaned in closer, resting her head on my shoulder as we walked. Maybe, she echoed softly. Over the next few weeks, we kept pushing ourselves, taking small steps toward a new normal. We went on a few dates, just the two of us, dinners, movies, even a day at the park where we just walked and talked like we used to. I could feel the walls I'd built up around myself slowly starting to come down. Mary was patient, never pushing too hard, always checking in to see how I was feeling. One evening, we decided to tackle one of the hardest things yet, a return to Charleston. Mary suggested it, saying, "I know it's going to be tough, but I think it could be good for us. To face it head on. To take back that place, make it ours again." The thought of going back there made my stomach churn, but I knew she was right. Avoiding it forever wouldn't help. "Okay," I agreed, after a long pause. "Let's do it." We drove down on a Saturday, the same route we'd taken so many times before. As we approached the city, I felt the tension building in my chest, memories flooding back. Mary reached over and squeezed my hand. "We're going to be okay," she whispered. We spent the day exploring the city, but with new eyes. We walked along the waterfront, visited the markets, and ate at a small cafe. At one point, we drove by the villa, the scene of everything that had torn us apart. I felt my heart race, my breath catch, but Mary reached out and took my hand. "That's behind us," she said softly, her voice steady. "This is our new chapter." I nodded, taking a deep breath. "Yeah," I agreed. "Our new chapter." By the end of the day, I felt lighter. It wasn't that the pain had vanished, but it felt less overwhelming, less consuming. I realized that we were finding our way back, one step at a time. The trust wasn't all there yet, but it was growing, little by little. That night, back in our hotel room, Mary and I sat on the balcony, watching the sun set over the water. She leaned against me, her head resting on my shoulder. "I know we're not there yet," she whispered, "but I feel like we're getting closer." I wrapped my arm around her, pulling her in a little tighter. "Yeah," I said softly. "We are." We sat there in silence for a while, letting the cool breeze wash over us. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of calm, of peace. I knew there would still be hard days, still be moments of doubt. But I also knew that we were stronger than the hurt, stronger than the mistakes. We were finding a way back to each other, to something real, something worth holding on to. And in that quiet moment, I felt a small spark of hope, a hope that maybe, just maybe, we could build something new from the ashes of what had been. Something stronger, something more honest, something that would last. A new beginning, one step at a time. The weeks that followed our trip to Charleston marked a turning point. It wasn't as though all the pain and doubt suddenly vanished, but something had shifted. We had faced down our demons in that city, and though the scars were still there, we had come out stronger on the other side. There was a new understanding between us, a quiet determination to rebuild what had been broken. But more than anything, I felt like we were starting to rediscover each other, to remember the reasons we had fallen in love in the first place. It was like peeling back layers of hurt and resentment to find the core of what had brought us together all those years ago. One Saturday morning, Mary suggested we go through some old boxes in the attic. "I found some of our letters the other day," she said with a small smile. "You know, the ones we used to write each other before we got married. I thought it might be nice to read them again." The idea made me feel a little uneasy. Those letters were from a different time, written by two people who had no idea what was coming. But I also felt a pull, a curiosity to see those words again, to remember the innocence and excitement of our early days together. "All right," I agreed. "Let's do it." We spent the morning rummaging through dusty boxes, laughing at old photos, and reminiscing about the life we had built. Eventually, we found the letters, tied together with a faded red ribbon. Mary handed them to me, her eyes soft with nostalgia. "You go first," she said, sitting down beside me. I untied the ribbon and pulled out the first letter, the paper worn and yellowed with age. As I unfolded it, I could almost feel the younger version of myself sitting down to write it, full of hope and love for the woman I was about to marry. "Dear Mary," I began, my voice quiet and a little shaky, "I can't believe that in just a few days, we'll be standing in front of all our friends and family, promising to spend the rest of our lives together. It feels like a dream, a beautiful, crazy dream that I never want to wake up from." As I read, I saw the words for what they were, a love letter from a man who truly believed in forever, who couldn't imagine a future without the woman he loved by his side. I paused, swallowing hard, as emotions swirled inside me. "I remember writing this," I said softly, glancing over at Mary. "I was so sure of us, so sure that we could face anything together." She reached out and took my hand, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "And we did, John. We faced a lot together, and we got through it. We made mistakes, yes, but that doesn't change what we had. It doesn't change what we still have." I nodded, feeling a lump in my throat. "I know. It's just hard to reconcile that with everything that's happened." She squeezed my hand, her voice gentle but firm. "That love is still there, John. It's been tested, it's been shaken, but it hasn't disappeared. I still love you, just as much as I did when you wrote that letter. Maybe even more, because I know how hard we've fought to hold on to it." I looked into her eyes, seeing the depth of her sincerity, and something inside me began to soften. Maybe she was right. Maybe the love that had brought us together was still there, buried beneath the rubble of everything that had happened, but still alive. We spent the rest of the day reading through the letters, laughing at our youthful enthusiasm, and occasionally wiping away a tear. Each letter was a reminder of the foundation we had built, a foundation that was still strong, even if the walls had crumbled. That night, as we sat together on the couch, Mary leaned her head on my shoulder and sighed. "Thank you for today," she whispered. "It was good to remember." "Yeah," I agreed, wrapping my arm around her. It was. A comfortable silence settled over us, and for the first time in a long time, I felt truly at peace. I realized that the anger, the bitterness, it was starting to fade. It wasn't gone, not completely, but it was losing its grip on me. In its place was a growing sense of acceptance, of forgiveness, both for Mary and for myself. As the days passed, we began to find joy in the little things again, the simple, everyday moments that we had taken for granted before. We cooked together, took long walks, and even started planning for the future, something I hadn't thought possible just a few months ago. One evening, as we sat outside watching the sunset, Mary turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever think about renewing our vows?" she asked, her voice tentative. The question caught me off guard. I hadn't thought about it, but now that she mentioned it, the idea didn't seem so far-fetched. I hadn't, I admitted. But maybe it's something we could consider. When we're ready. She nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I'd like that," she said softly. "When the time is right." We fell silent again, watching as the sky turned from gold to pink to deep purple. I thought about the road we had traveled, the pain we had endured, and the work we had put in to get to this point. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but maybe that was okay. Maybe perfection wasn't the goal. Maybe it was about finding a way to love each other, flaws and all, and choosing to stay even when things got hard. As the stars began to appear, I reached over and took Mary's hand, feeling a sense of calm wash over me. We were still a work in progress, still healing, but we were healing together. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like we were truly on the right path. "I love you, Mary," I said quietly, the words coming easier than they had in months. She turned to me, her eyes filled with warmth and love. "I love you too, John. Always." We sat there, holding hands, letting the peace of the moment settle over us. There was still a long road ahead, but for now, it was enough to know that we were walking it together, step by step, rediscovering the love that had always been there, waiting for us to find it again. A year passed since the day I'd first confronted Mary, and what a year it had been. It felt like we had lived a lifetime in those 12 months, navigating the jagged terrain of betrayal, doubt, forgiveness, and, finally, reconciliation. But here we were, still standing, still holding on. We'd done the hard work, the counseling, the long, sometimes painful conversations, the moments where we had to face our worst fears and deepest insecurities. We'd rebuilt our trust brick by brick, learning to lean on each other again, slowly but surely. And somewhere along the way, the wounds had started to heal. Mary had kept her promise. She'd shown me, every day, in small ways and big, that she was committed to us, to our marriage. She had cut all ties with Steve, changed her routines, and made an effort to include me in every part of her life. She was transparent, open, and patient, even when my doubts crept back in. She never pushed me to move faster than I was ready, always letting me set the pace. And I, too, had learned to let go of the anger, to stop clinging to the past, and to focus on what was right in front of me, a woman who was trying, every day, to make up for her mistakes and to prove her love. I realized that forgiveness wasn't a single moment, but a series of choices, day after day, to let go of the hurt and embrace the possibility of something new. One day, a few weeks before our wedding anniversary, Mary came to me with a smile. "I've been thinking," she said, her eyes twinkling with that familiar light that I hadn't seen in so long. "What if we renewed our vows? I know it's soon, but I feel like we've come so far, and I'd like to celebrate that, with you." I looked at her, feeling a rush of warmth in my chest. The idea didn't feel so far-fetched anymore. In fact, it felt right. It felt like the next step in this journey we'd been on, a chance to acknowledge how far we'd come and to reaffirm our commitment to each other. "I'd like that too," I replied, taking her hand in mine. "I really would." We decided to keep it simple, just a small gathering with a few close friends and family, the people who had been there for us through the hardest times. We chose a spot in the local park where we'd often gone for walks, a place that had always felt special to us. The day arrived, and the weather was perfect, a warm, sunny afternoon, with a gentle breeze rustling through the trees. I stood there, waiting for Mary, feeling a strange mix of nerves and excitement, like I was about to marry her for the first time all over again. When she appeared, walking toward me in a simple white dress, I felt my breath catch in my throat. She looked beautiful, more beautiful than I'd ever seen her. And it wasn't just the dress or the way the sun caught her hair, it was the look in her eyes, the quiet strength and love that radiated from her. I realized then how much we'd been through together and how grateful I was to be standing there with her. We stood before our friends and family, and as the officiant began to speak, I felt a calm settle over me. This wasn't about starting over, not really. It was about continuing on, about choosing each other again, every day, despite everything. When it was time for the vows, Mary went first. She took my hands in hers, her voice steady and clear. "John," she began, her eyes glistening with tears, "I know I've hurt you, and I know that I've made mistakes. But every day, I am grateful that you chose to stay, to give us another chance. I promise to love you, to honor you, and to never take our love for granted again. I promise to be the best partner I can be, to be honest, and to always fight for us, no matter what." Her words hit me deep, and I squeezed her hands, feeling a wave of emotion swell in my chest. When it was my turn, I took a deep breath and spoke from the heart. "Mary, this past year has been the hardest of my life, but also one of the most important. I've learned so much about myself, about you, about what it means to really love someone. I promise to forgive, to trust, and to build a future with you that is stronger than our past. I love you, and I choose you, today, tomorrow, and every day after that." There were tears in both our eyes as we exchanged rings, a symbol of our renewed commitment. When the officiant declared us remarried, I pulled Mary into my arms and kissed her, a deep, passionate kiss that felt like the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another. Our friends and family cheered, and we turned to face them, hand in hand, feeling a sense of joy and relief that I hadn't known was possible. We had made it through the storm, and we were still standing. After the ceremony, we had a small reception in the park. We laughed, danced, and celebrated, surrounded by the people who loved us. It was simple, beautiful, and perfect in its own way. I looked at Mary as she talked with our friends, her face lit up with happiness, and I felt a sense of peace settle over me. Later that night, as we sat together on our porch, just the two of us, watching the stars, Mary rested her head on my shoulder. "I'm so glad we did this," she whispered. "It feels like a new beginning." I nodded, feeling her warmth against me. "It does," I agreed. "It really does." We sat there in comfortable silence, the sounds of the night around us. I realized that our journey wasn't over, there would still be challenges, still be days when doubt crept in. But I also knew that we were stronger now, more honest, more real. We had faced the worst and come out the other side, and that was something to hold on to. "I love you, Mary," I said quietly, and this time, there was no hesitation, no doubt. She lifted her head, her eyes shining with tears. "I love you too, John. Always." We held each other close, letting the quiet of the night wrap around us. I felt a sense of contentment I hadn't felt in a long time, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay. That love could survive even the darkest of times, as long as we were willing to fight for it. We sat there, side by side, watching the stars, knowing that we had found our way back to each other. And that, for me, was the most beautiful ending I could have ever hoped for.